Welcome everybody to Coffee and Compliance, where we connect with experts on various compliance and security topics. I'm Matt Phillips, Partner Relations Manager at Vanta and former auditor. Today we're going to be chatting with Steve Conley, IT Director at Inside Assurance, to demystify security policies. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here. Pleasure to talk to you today. Look forward to being a part of the discussion and giving some people some thought to go away with about policies.
Yeah, I know there's a couple things I want to touch with you today. Let's kind of start at a high level. Could you maybe give us a little insight on what a security policy is?
Sure. Policies are the written word of management. Make no mistake about it. It is what management says are the rules of the organization. These are to be followed, and it is typically based on the requirements of the organization. Organizations with complex business models might have more complexity in their policies. Simple business models might be more related to overall creation of policies that are easier to deal with. However, it is still the word of management. So the complexity is going to be based on that organization. Key thing is to make sure that the processes and the interactions and the way you write your policies are dealing with the competency levels of your individual.
Yeah, that's a really good definition. So let's kind of imagine for a second, I'm an organization. I don't really have any policies, but I'm pretty established, and I'm ready to start creating them. What's some things I should think about capturing in my policies?
That's a great question. A lot of organizations are already managing documents. So the key is what's your document control look like already? What kind of documents are you dealing with? Because a policy becomes another document. So we don't want to create the burden of document management if we don't already have some sort of way to manage our documents. Is your document paper or plastic? Meaning, is it still on paper, or is it something that's in an electronic format? Contractors have blueprints. They also have computers to design the blueprints. So these are two different types of documents, and how we handle those as documents will come into a little more understanding as we move along. What else? I mean, retailers have inventories, but those are all electronic these days. So as we control documents, we begin to look at what are the requirements. Typical requirements: titles, dates, authors, right? Version numbers of these documents. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you typically add roles and responsibilities in there?
Roles and responsibilities based on the document. So when we talk about policies, absolutely. But in an overall document, a role and responsibility for creating an inventory, typically we would want to know who's extracting and policies around those data transfers. But if we go back to what is a document, how do I handle it, and what are the attributes? We have to control the document. That's first of all. We have to have some way of identifying its classification. Because again, I go back to paper or plastic, the recipe for WD-40 is still on a piece of paper in one safe at one location. So we still have paper in the mix of corporate secrets. So let's go back. What else does a document need? It needs to know where you're going to keep it. We just spoke of that. And is it adequately protected against loss, confidentiality, and integrity? So the document itself doesn't change whether it's a list, a standard, or whether it's a policy. It still has a life cycle. It still needs an author. It still needs a creator. It still needs to be managed through the attributes of the life cycle: change control, preserve the legibility, and make sure it's distributed and disseminated.
Is there anything you should really keep out of policies? I know there's always a conversation of policies, procedures. Policies can get really busy. Is there stuff that you should consider putting elsewhere, so it's not quite as busy?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I get that question a lot. It comes down to another concept of having one big giant policy or a bunch of little policies. And again, what's right for the organization is right for the organization. You decide. But when it comes to what is in the policy and what is not in the policy, policies are high level. Again, we've already talked about some of the attributes. Other documents that associate with policies could be a standards document. Those often have some very detailed, precise, and often other competencies required to generate those standards. I'm not expecting a CISO to generate my firewall standard. So once again, we have different responsibilities for those different documents. So again, between policies, procedures, standards, what about a charter? Again, a long PCI now requires a charter. We like to see an ISO charter, HIPAA charter. These tell your reader how you're approaching that standard and that framework. So again, what to keep in a policy? I mean, just the list is fairly simple. Table of contents, document control, revision history, purpose statement. Again, here's where you mentioned roles and responsibilities. How does the policy objective meet your security objective? That's a perfect way to determine how mature your policies are. The body of the policy should be succinct. And at the very end, always discuss policy violations and sanctioning against policy violators. This is important.
Yeah, that's always a big piece, having that. And typically you see at the bottom of the policy of what to do if something's to go wrong with this policy, and where to reach out. That's definitely a key piece.
Sure.
So let's think about maybe, so we have our policy, it's created. How are we informing our organization? How do we let our employees know that, hey, this policy is now in play and you need to adhere to it?
That one is the one that most people ask. How do we get this rolled out? Again, let's go back to our assumption that we're dealing with an organization who's a fairly mature organization. They've never had the reason to write policies. They know they should have them. Their security is fairly mature, but now they've been asked by an organization to present all of this in writing, and they don't have it. So first of all, you have to decide what it is you want to put down in the policy, right? Decide if you want one big policy or break it out into different policies. That usually, again, is dependent upon the organization. Do I have one security person or 100? Chances are, if I have 100 security people, those types of policies are going to fall over on the leader of the security department. So we might break those out. So those review processes are more focused to the people who have the competencies for that review. We've got to get the policies in draft mode. That is one of the biggest stumbling blocks. Analysis paralysis will kill you in this part of get the draft out there. It's not going to be perfect. Everybody wants that perfect draft. It's not going to be. Get it out there, get it reviewed. Then what? During that review part, start to communicate it to the organization, top down. Got to have buy-in from the top of the organization. Otherwise, policies don't work. Once you've done that, training. It's all about training the organization. Then we come to final publication. This is where you turn it from a Word document to a PDF. This is where you say, hey, this is now the law. You actually post the date in your training and you say on this day, on this time, you will be required. I find it's a DNA change. And most organizations go through it. Some take a little longer, some don't, but it will happen. Your policies and procedures, when people understand this is making my job easier, they buy off on it, and now the DNA starts to change.
And how do you typically see when you make changes to those? Do you have employees re-sign off on them? Do you just let them know, hey, this policy's changed, go check it out? What's kind of like that maybe continual monitoring of policies?
That's a great observation on policy management. So what happens is, again, all policies have a life cycle. We should expect constant communication campaigns, constant management meetings throughout the life cycle, and constant training about what the policies are telling us. Most compliance frameworks now require some sort of training on hire and annual training by requirement. What you're noticing is a lot of the frameworks are starting to call out things like role-based training. So how does your policy handling the require for OWASP top 10 in your developers producing code facing the public internet? Is that in policy? Don't know. It should be if that's the case. So now all of a sudden we have to institute a new policy. This is where oftentimes for instance, I remember taking administrative rights away from DBAs who had SA for all their life. How do you take that away from a DBA? By policy. Just by policy. I'm sorry, you can't have it anymore. So you're always going to meet resistance to these changes in policy. It's part of the culture. A lot of folks think you're taking things away when in fact you're enabling. That is the recipe. Use the policies as business enablers.
Yeah, I see it a lot where, if something goes wrong, where do we look? Go look at the policy. That'll guide you.
Yeah, yeah. And I say that to so many people. They ask me a question and I say, what does the standard say? I don't know. You haven't read the standard and you're trying to comply to it. Read the policies, understand them, know their meaning, and the DNA will change. I promise.
Yeah, that's probably the hardest thing is getting employees to read policies when they're signing off on them. Nobody, it's not fun to read them, but it's good. You need to, and you kind of have to.
I agree.
Cool. So yeah, like this is really good. This is really good. So we've created the policy. We've kind of talked about that continual monitoring, how to inform our organization. Let's kind of talk about when we get to the big show, the big thing everybody's preparing for, the big scary thing, the audit. How does that come into play, and where you as an auditor, how do you see policies when you come in?
Wonderful question, because again, this is where every auditor, the first thing they look at is the word of management. Let's go back to what I said in the beginning of our discussion. Policies, word of management. When is that the most important time in your life as a policy owner? The morning that you get up and say, yes, Your Honor, because this is what represents the legal word of management as well. And if you don't think TJ Maxx didn't have policies drug into court after the wireless breach, they were. So the word of management is policy. What else? I make sure that nonconformities don't exist because you broke the rules. Guess what? Most nonconformities and most audits are rule breakers. Now, is the rule break intention? Is it intentional? Was it done intentionally? Not always, but it is a breaking of the rule. What else? Gosh, I love to see a mapping from the policies to your standard I'm auditing. Regardless of the standard, if I don't have to go looking for what your words are to address my requirement for the audit, and you give that to me, you've already told me you know where it is, and that you have the ability to tell me means you've done some of my work for me as the auditor. So I begin to have more trust in you. I know that you've taken the time to say, this is the standard, this is the policy, and we meet the two. So that's always something I like to see.
Yeah, I feel like I've spent so much time when I was doing auditing, reading policies and just trying to put that spider web together to map everything, and then hopefully I don't have to go back to the customer and ask them to help me figure stuff out.
That's always a challenge.
That really resonates me with organizations not following their policies for very simple things. For me, I think I saw a lot when I was auditing, the simplest control of password configurations is like, that's always like a huge fail, and it's such an easy thing to follow. And you'd see in the policy, they'd say, 10 characters, but everything's configured to 8 characters. It's not like they don't have any policy in place or any configurations in place. They're just not, nobody took the time to, hey, let's look at this policy. Are we actually following these configurations we're saying here? That was always a huge reoccurring error that I would see. Is there anything that you might see or have seen in the past? Or
yeah, that's so. We go back to who's creating the policy, and you said something very important, and that's if we haven't read the policy to ensure we're adhering to it. That's part of that initial policy review. What are we doing, and are we writing what we do and doing what we write? Perfect observation of that. And I've seen it many times. What are the common errors? using templates is awesome because oftentimes we don't have the level of effort available with it. We're trying to keep the lights on. We're trying to keep the cash registers ringing. How do you ask someone to go write a policy? Back in the day, when you were expected to write a policy, you just put your feet up until they quit asking. You just didn't write it. But nowadays you can't. The compliance says, no, you are gonna write that policy. So using templates is great. The key is, what does the template say? You must go look at that template, make sure that you have aligned it with your organization. Using templates is a great way to jumpstart your policy base because, again, templates can give you the choices of integrating multiple policies. Typically, templates will also allow you to define more detailed procedures and tie them in nicely. So nothing wrong with that. Versioning. Here's what I say. Why would you put the version of your policy in more than one place? And I say that because I have a scar from that, where I used to put the versioning on the title page, versioning in the headers and footers, and versioning in the revision block. And the minute you miss one, you just had a testing exception in an audit. Put the version in one place. That's all you need it. Make sure you have the correct versioning information and the document control around that. Revision cycles, right? So if you have a 2-year revision cycle on a document, but you say everything's reviewed annually, again, you just violated your own policy. I know of documents that don't need to be reviewed more than once every 2 years. That's the case, just say it, right?
Yeah.
And really the last thing I see is just good, adequate revisioning notes, comments, proper approvals. Again, whoever's writing or authoring the document needs to have a separate approver. That can often be a mistake where you're writing and approving your same document. But other than that, it's I always go back to write what you do what you write, and that's it.
Yeah. Do
So,
you, just to bring it back to something we were talking about earlier of like kind of things to keep out of policies before we wrap up here, what are your thoughts on titles in the policy? Should you keep names out of policies?
oh
Or
yeah,
should
keep names. So this is a great discussion, and I just had this last week with more than one person. What's the difference between accountability and responsibility? Because in a policy, we can assign responsibility for the inventory, but we need accountability for the asset. What's the accountability model? Who shows up in court, right? So I can have someone responsible for everything in the data center. I do a risk evaluation and I have a residual risk that says I've accepted a 5. After all treatment, after the inherent risk was calculated, who accepts that risk? That usually is a title because I have to take that title to court with me. If it's an overall responsibility of all the inventory, it's the IT department. That's kind of what I say.
Yeah. Yeah, I always get asked that question of whether you should put in names or not. And
Just
also even
titles.
just having to update if someone changes responsibility, it's easier to change the role than pull out a name
Oh yeah,
from their documents.
and that's another reason. I like that
Awesome.
reason.
Well, this has been such a great time, Steve. It was a pleasure speaking with you. For folks listening in, we hope today's chat was really helpful to demystify security policies. You can learn more about security and compliance topics in the resources section of our website. Subscribe to our social channels for more content like this. For customers that feel so inclined, we greatly appreciate any feedback you have for us on G2. See you next time, everybody.
Thanks.